Hello, greetings everyone. I am Susanna Clark, the director of the Mahindra Humanities Center here at Harvard University, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's event, Out of Place and Time, Thinking Migration Through the Humanities. This event is supported by the Andrew Double Mellon Foundation and is organized by this year's Mahindra Humanities Center postdoc fellows. And they are Simona Capisani, Daniel Grant, Delali Kumavier, Marcos Laito G. Almeida, Daniel McDonald, and Howie Tam. Today's forum is the most public event that we have all year involving the postdocs. And so I want to take this opportunity to say publicly, well, in fact, to broadcast how tremendous our postdocs all are as scholars and as a group. And I think this will be abundantly clear to everyone joining us for today's event. So through this event, the postdoc fellows sought to bring together critical and creative approaches to migration in the humanities in order to question and elucidate approaches that reformulate how we study the movement of humans, other beings, and things across the globe. And with that, it is now my great pleasure to hand things over to Simona, who will introduce today's event. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Susie. I wanted to take this opportunity to say that the fellows have been looking forward to this discussion between our esteemed panelists. We're very grateful that they were able to be here today, albeit under the challenging circumstances of this past year. I also wanted to take a moment to thank the hardworking staff, including Candice Kang, Daria Lugina, and Mary McKinnon of the Mahindra Humanities Center, whose efforts have helped to bring this event to fruition. As Susie mentioned, the topics and theme of this event grew out of the research interests of the fellows and our conversations that we've been having over the past several months. So primarily, migration seems to be this historical category of analysis with no clear beginning, middle, and end. It also has allowed humanistic inquiry to reanimate questions of displacement across both time and space. It's helped prompt inquiry to intervene in multiple intersecting global crises, and also to renew investigations into the myth and power of the nation state. But migration can also construct binaries, which reinforce systems of racial inequality and also dispossession. And furthermore, deeper histories of human migration underlie the present moment, and they compel both scholars, writers, curators to contend with this long legacy of colonialism, empire, and state power. So it's within this context that we asked our speakers to reflect on their own work and to consider how such matters can be found in a range of places, both from material artifacts to national mythologies. So before turning to the reflections of our panel participants, I wanted to take a moment to remind the audience and all of you in attendance that you're welcome to submit questions throughout the event at any time using the question and answer button that's down below on your screen. And that also additionally, a recording of this event will be available on the Mahindra Humanities Center website and on our YouTube channel should you wish to share it or revisit it at a later time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to my colleague, Daniel McDonald, who will be introducing today's speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Simona. So what I will do here briefly is introduce our latter two speakers, and then before each panelist presentation, give a more in-depth biography. So it is our pleasure to have Maza Mengiste here today, a novelist and essayist. Maza Mengiste is the Assistant Director of the Queen's College MFA program in Creative Writing and Literary Translation, where she teaches fiction. Welcome, Maza. Likewise, we are pleased to have Natalie Diaz here today, an enrolled member of the Gila River Indian tribe. Natalie Diaz teaches at the Creative Writing program at Arizona State University and is a prolific poet. Welcome, Natalie. And to introduce our first speaker, Yanis Hamalakis, he is an archaeologist and writer. He is the Joukowsky Family Professor of Archaeology and Professor of Modern Greek Studies at Brown University. He specializes in archaeology of the prehistoric Aegean, as well as historical archaeology, including ethnography and anthropology. His research interests include nationalism, post-colonialism, and migration studies. He is one of the curators of the exhibit Transient Matter, Assemblages of Migration in the Mediterranean, at the Heffenreffer Museum at Brown University, which is now viewable as a virtual exhibit on the museum's website. Welcome, Giannis. The virtual floor is now yours.
Hello, Daniel. Thank you very much. And hello, everybody. It's been a pleasure to be with you today, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. As Daniel said, I'm an archaeologist. I do conventional archaeological work, like I dig a Neolithic settlement in Greece. But at the same time, I have done a lot of work on nation and nationhood and on the constructions of identity more broadly. I think it was that work on nationalism and nationhood actually brought me into the field of migration. Of course, contingency is important in this. And I happened to be in Greece during what was called the Summer of Migration 2015 and 16, and the year of migration 15 and 16. And I experienced what in the media was projected as the migration crisis. It was, of course, the moment of the so-called Syrian exodus, the movement of people from Syria as a result of the war in Syria through Greece into Northern Europe. It occurred to me then that as an archaeologist, as somebody who is interested on borders, on nationhood, on constructions of identity, and as somebody who's interested on materiality and on temporality, migration is a topic that I should study or should be able to say things that other colleagues, other disciplines perhaps are not able to say, because our primary focus as archaeologists is on material things, on materiality, on ruins in the broader sense, but also on the texture and the affective sensorial qualities of human experience. I should say also that another reason that actually prompted me to work on migration was a political reason, an activist reason. The idea that at a moment that people portray as a moment of migration crisis, there are issues that need to be explored that go beyond that narrative. It was, in fact, and it is, not a migration crisis, but a reception crisis, a crisis on the part of the societies of the global north that cannot, will not come to terms with their own history of colonization. What I think is happening right now is the return of the colonized. The idea that the durational properties, the durational qualities of history show themselves up in the shape of people who come from the global south and demand to be seen, demand to enter into the global north. With that introduction, I want to actually show you a few images from my most recent visit to my site, to one of my sites, which is the site of Moria on the island of Lesbos. And I want to share a screen for a second. So the borderland of Lesbos is, as you can see on the map here, very, very close to Turkey. And it's one of the main passages from Turkey to Lesbos and thus to the European Union and thus to the global north in many ways. My last visit to this site, to the site of Moria, which was the largest refugee camp in Europe, was in October, was after the big fire of September 2020, when this whole artifact, the artifact of the camp of Moria, was completely destroyed. And what I experienced was an archaeological ruin of sorts, something that resembled archaeological sites, conventionally speaking. But it also occurred to me that a lot can actually be understood by looking at this site as an archaeological artifact, as a site, things that we could not understand when this camp was in operation. And I've been actually monitoring this for the last 5 years. So here's some images from that ruin that demanded our attention. This, by the way, was an art studio that was completely destroyed. the artist who worked there was actually one of our collaborators in the exhibition that Daniel mentioned. And this was, by the way, the Asylum Service, and I think it's worth exploring from close up the materiality of separation, of bordering, and of, in many ways, what anthropologists have called global apartheid. A double space, a corridor to separate the migrants from the asylum service. And this is from inside. This is, in fact, the accounting of the number of people present in the camp. So this is the last day before the fire. So I want to stay with the pictures for a moment and read you from a photo essay I just finished as a kind of a reflection for our discussion and see how we can actually connect humanities more broadly to the issue of migration. As I was walking on, I realized that what we are now gaining access to are areas of spaces that we, white men, locals of sorts, could never possibly have had while the camp was in operation. It felt wrong. It felt voyeuristic at times. In most cases, however, we did not have to enter enclosed spaces because, especially in the areas outside the closed compound, it was all open to us. Now, the area was mostly a vast, open-air ruin, an archaeological site with the walls and the roofs of the structures missing, but with the layout, the foundations intact. A perfect site plan to read. Features that were not known to us as an outside observer are now revealing themselves to us. Interior hearths, sunken pits, enclosed outdoor toilets, laid interior floors, and sleeping platforms. As it was as if this place became more readable, better understood as a ruin. And I want to finish with this passage. At Moria, what was burned was much more than the largest migrant camp in Europe. Moria was a ruin foretold. Its burning had been predicted and announced several times over, including in the smaller fires that had engulfed the camp in migrant revolts in the past 5 years. But in its ashes, we can see clearly, more clearly now than before, the face of Europe, of the global north, with its so-called migration crisis. We can trace contours and feel the texture of the new global apartheids. In the meantime, others will draw in these ashes the shapes of their futures. I don't know how much time I still have. I wanted to say a couple of things that actually relate to the broader issue of migration in the humanities. I believe that through the study of migration, through the study that actually goes beyond any specific discipline and employs the various skills, ideas, and practices of many disciplines, social anthropology, archaeology, as well as conventional political science and other disciplines, we can actually understand better the contemporary world through a range of new concepts that can actually speak to us through this materiality. For example, the concept of condensed materiality, the idea that certain things and objects, for example, the cell phone, becomes an iconic object that actually compresses many different phenomena. It becomes a memory object, it becomes a recording object, it becomes an object that is vital for people's journeys. Or the idea of accelerated ruination, how quickly things become ruins, how quickly things become completely deserted and people move on. Or the idea of emplacement. Very often we think of materiality as displacement, But what I felt and what I saw in my areas of study, like Moria or in other places in Lesbos and elsewhere, are people's attempt to emplace themselves, to construct place and locality through the construction of shelter, through the construction of cooking facilities, through the construction of art spaces or even libraries, even if they knew that they're going to be there for only a few months or a year. So these are some of the things that I think are important to reflect on while we are reflecting on contemporary migration. So these are some of the thoughts that I would like to start with, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Yannis. Our next presenter is Maza Mengiste, who teaches fiction and is the Assistant Director of the Queen's College MFA program in Creative Writing and Literary Translation. She is a novelist and essayist. Her second novel, The Shadow King, is shortlisted for the 2020 Booker Prize and was a 2020 LA Times Book Prize fiction finalist. It was named Best Book of the Year by the New York Times, NPR, Elle, Time, and more. Her debut novel, Beneath the Lion's Gaze, was selected by The Guardian as one of the 10 best contemporary African books and named one of the best books of 2010 by Christian Science Monitor, Boston Globe, and other publications. She is a recipient of an American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Literature, the Premio Il Ponte, and fellowships from the Fulbright Scholars Program, the National Endowment for the Arts and Creative Capital. Her work can be found in the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, Granta, The Guardian, the New York Times, Rolling Stone, and the BBC, among other places. Maza, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It is really a pleasure to be here, and what an honor to be able to speak alongside Yannis and Natalie. I'm going to open this by sharing a screen, and I hope PowerPoint is my friend today, and I hope everyone can see this. I'm going to be speaking for a number of years now. I have been immersed and invested in understanding the history between Italy and East Africa, especially as it pertains to the fascist invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935 in an attempt to colonize the country. It was Mussolini's effort to expand an empire that included at that moment Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia. But it was also an attempt to expand Italy's territory so that Italians who were emigrating out of Italy, often to the United States, and to Australia and different places that Italians were going in search of better futures, better opportunities, a livelihood. They were leaving Italy, and Mussolini wanted them to go to Ethiopia, to make Ethiopia Italy so that it could be called something other than migration. It could be a settlement. Italians came, and the photographs that were sent back to Italy as a result of the war, during the war, were often similar to what I'm showing you right now, which is images that reinforced a narrative of Italians as benevolent, jovial, so interested in music and good food and wine that they could not possibly have organized or enacted the atrocities and brutalities that they did. I've been very fascinated with what these photographs can reveal to us, even things that were not necessarily intended by the photographer. When I look at this image of these Italians, there are two people that I notice in particular, and I would like to direct your attention to the lower left-hand corner, where you see two Ethiopian men, or East African men to be maybe less specific, who are refusing to turn around. And I'd like to come back to that a little bit later. Italy routinely censored accounts of the war in Ethiopia. The reports instead stressed the civilizing mission. Language was carefully constructed to keep Italians confident that this colonizing endeavor was actually a civilizing mission, and that they had a right to take other people's land because people didn't know how to govern themselves. Most of the notices about this war would talk about the roads being built, the bridges being built, the telephone lines that were coming up, all the ways that Italians were helping to move Africans towards a more modern future. All the while, it was shrouding the bloody aspects of this imperial ambition. It wasn't even until 1996 that the Italian government admitted that it had used mustard gas. I don't think there has been any real reckoning with the concentration camps that were built there, the execution camps, the black sites, or the massacres. What we did get were these photographs. This photograph has become pivotal to me in understanding some of the discourse, not only around this war, but what is happening, I believe, around migration right now. If Germany has had its Nuremberg trials, and if South Africa has had its Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what has been missing in Italy is a kind of post-war accountability that really forces the harsh realities of this war into light. What we've tended to get are shadowy outlines of the brutalities without a real confrontation with the past. And I think some people have asked me, well, you know, or said to me, why are you so worried about this? Isn't that in the past? Shouldn't we be focused on what's happening right now? But I think that language helps to create a national identity. I think the stories that we tell ourselves, that we tell each other about our past, helps to cement a national identity, helps to create a collective memory, helps to create a collective ethos. And what happens if there has been no language spoken around a specific event? What if there is no vocabulary in which to address those past injustices? How do we begin to reckon with the current injustices that have happened? When Italy was unified in 1861, there was a quote, a popular quote that was attributed to one particular statesman. Abbiamo fatto l'Italia, adesso dobbiamo fare gli italiani. We've made Italy, now we have to make Italians. This is in 1861, and that collective character of what makes an Italian was often also confirmed, defined by skin color, by white skin. And I think that the issues of migration, people who've come to settle in Italy from East Africa, from Libya, from West Africa, from Asia, wherever they have come from, they have forced a reconsideration of what this Italy is and what Italian means. But if there has been no vocabulary to deal with Italy's past racism, how is there going to be a vocabulary to begin to deal with the racist political actions that continue to happen on the Mediterranean, and that are allowing people to die simply because they don't look Italian? I'd like to move on to a second photograph, third photograph, because lately I've been immersed and speaking with a friend of mine who is also a visual artist. His name is Dawit Petros. He's an Eritrean-born artist. Both of us have been in conversation for a number of years about the ways that art can begin to address the humanitarian crisis. And I like that Yanis said it's a reception crisis. The humanitarian crisis happening across the waters, also in Libya and other places along the coast of Africa. When I'm looking at this work of Dawit's, and this one is called Prologue 3, and it is taken from a series that he calls The Stranger's Notebook, I'm reminded of the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas' claim that the face is the most naked part of us. It is the most defenseless part of our body. This is why we tend to pose our faces in certain ways. We tend to hide from those who are looking at us if we don't want to be seen emotionally or mentally. We wear masks, and there's a vulnerability to the face that is both an invitation to violence and a restriction of it. And in Dawit's work, where there are no faces, where in fact those faces are deliberately obscured, there's another discourse that I think is possible here. It's a discourse that begins with not what's assumed, but what is unknown. And there's a way to articulate through his images what's absent in the conversations we're currently having. I think about these conversations as a historical destination that requires an engagement with art like his, with art and literature that subverts the discourses we've been having. There's so much of the media that's around migration, around refugees, so much media around people who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, transgender people, that's focused on the face and what people look like. And in Dawit's art, I see the mirror is directed at the landscape, but it also points to the spectator. It points to us, the viewer, and it's proposing a kind of dialogue that begins with uncertainty on the viewer's part, but at the same time, it forces our face to possibly be situated in that mirror if we were ever to approach the human beings close enough. I'd like to note, it's interesting, I chose this photo because this man here holding up this mirror is turned backwards in the same way that these two men are here. And I see a dialogue that can occur between these two images. I'd like to close out by just pulling up this image. And a few years ago, or actually maybe it was only a year ago, this pandemic has done weird things with time. But this is an image of a young man who was Madhane, who was convicted of being a human trafficker, even though he did not look like the actual person that they were looking for. He was in fact a refugee, an Eritrean refugee. He spent 3 years in prison, even when DNA tests proved that it was not him, even when the sister of the human trafficker told Italian police and investigators that they had the wrong man. To the Italians, his face was interchangeable with the human trafficker. He was eventually released, but all the proof was there. It was not about proof. There was some kind of discourse that needed to happen, some kind of language that needed to exist for justice to have happened, and that was absent. I think the work that I have shown and some of these photographs, I hope, invite a search into what a face contains, the history that's in it, and what we see of ourselves. I think that was, yeah, I went over. Sorry about that. Let me see if I can exit out of here. Thanks, Daniel.
No problem.
That was very polite.
No worries. Thank you, Maza. And our next panelist is Natalie Diaz. Natalie Diaz was born and raised in the Fort Mojave Indian village in Needles, California, on the banks of the Colorado River. She is Mojave and an enrolled member of the Gila River Indian tribe. Her first poetry collection, When My Brother Was an Aztec, was published by Copper Canyon Press in 2012. She is a 2018 MacArthur Foundation Fellow, a Lennon Literary Fellow, and a Native Arts Council Foundation Artist Fellow. She was awarded a Breadlow Fellowship, the Holmes National Poetry Prize, a Hodder Fellowship, and a Penn Cittavella Ranieri Foundation Residency, as well as being awarded a U.S. Artist Ford Fellowship. Natalie teaches at the Arizona State University Creative Writing MFA program. Natalie, the virtual floor is yours.
Gracias. Iwan Jahotan, Ivak Idum. It's my luck to be alongside Yanis and Raza. Yeah, it's really lucky to be here. And gracias for those wonderful presentations. I'm just going to start with some ways that I have been thinking about migration. I think something that I have been thinking a lot about in terms of reading, Greek poets is a term, diaspiro, and that translated as I scatter. And that's something that I've been thinking a lot through that word and through that imagining and imagining what that formation looks like. It feels really important. I think migration is often something that U.S. natives and indigenous folks don't seem often to be pulled into conversations about it. And yet I think it's an essential conversation as we think about those concepts that were mentioned before, but the idea of arriving and the idea of being received and the reciprocity or the lack of reciprocity in that relationship. So I'm just going to read some notes and ask some foundational questions that may or may not weave through some of what we end up speaking about. Migration does not erase, does not forfeit, does not dislocate indigeneity. In fact, migration is essential to it. And again, I think that that's something we've kind of moved away from, is that, once you're in a state of or condition of or momentum of migration, we tend to ask you to dislocate from languages, from homelands. Indigeneity, the way that I see it, is a relationship with land and water, with how we arrive and are received at that land and water. And it's a reciprocity beyond human prohibitions. And what I mean by that is that I believe anyone who arrives in a particular way and begins a practice of that arrival in a new land, in what I might even call my land, can practice and have an indigenous relationship. So I have a few foundational questions in relation to the humanities and the ways within the humanities we are good at expressing certain languages, but we are less good in terms of the practices of some of the things that we say. And when we do find the language for migration, we often speak about it as if it's distant, and as if we, I'm speaking about the humanities I know and am coming to know, we in the United States assume we are its only destination. So I have a couple simple questions, but they've been helpful to me as I think about this. I'm located on the US-Mexico border. What are we actually talking about when we're talking about migration? I think that's a question that we all in the United States need to try on. Who are we talking about? Where are we talking about when we talk about migration? And which directions are we using to define migration in our conversations? So a question that I often have in my work is, how do I treat history in relationship to the movements of my people? How do I read it or retell it when this same history governs me? Do I want an alternative history, or do I want something before and beyond that, something that allows our multiple and perpetual origins? migration as we use it tends to deny the necessity of having multiple origins. And I feel like that is something that's a part of my perspective as an Indigenous person, is that an origin is not an event. It's a perpetual happening. It's cyclical, and it's a return. And often those who migrate are denied their many and multiple origins. Another question I have is, how do we begin or continue to think from within migration and migratory reciprocities and autonomies about Indigenous or Native self-determination? I think this is a really important question, and beginning to or continuing to develop the lexicon for that is essential to the ways that we begin to find new pathways for, again, receiving and arriving at. How do we converge and diverge as we move through the lenses of migration as a foundation of indigeneity? And so I'm just going to read from a few of my notes. I'm thinking a lot about migration from with diaspora, from within it, from of diaspora, versus, of course, a way that I have been almost tethered to thinking about migration, which is that the settler colonial, the settler conquistador, the conquest, things like manifest destiny. Migration is dangerous because it constellates the stories of the land. And of course, land being the key to most migrations in terms of thinking of land as property. So the idea of capitalism and how there's a necessity to dislocate us. I think again about the danger in terms of diaspora, in terms of the aspiro, to scatter, to disseminate, to germinate, meaning therefore to grow. And I'm thinking a lot, especially being on the US-Mexico border, of the ways that we have weaponized the very earth itself in terms of migration. And so as you have spoke about, and as some of your work references and lives within, as well as your lived experiences, the weaponization, of course, of the ocean and of water. I'm thinking of the Rio Grande, or the Rio Grande in particular, what it means to have to cross that river. Of course, we have the transatlantic slave trade. We have the Middle Passage. I'm thinking of Aleppo, Syria, Cuba, all of these places. And thinking of that in relationship to the conversations we're currently having about abolition, especially considering detention. And something a lot of people don't realize is that there is a very large percentage, at times half or more, of the detained migrants crossing the US-Mexico border have been from the African continent. A lot of the people that my partner works with are from Cameroon. And so, it's something that that is very much left out of the conversation. So I think in terms of from within the United States, being able to constellate these things, that we might protest a Muslim band at New York airports and completely forget about what's happening on the US-Mexico border. But the necessity of constellating what's happening here, as well as what's happening, in these other places. I want to think also something I've been thinking about as migration, which is not the same thing as mapping, which tends to be the way we think about it. What does migration alongside or next to diaspora, what does that allow of return? What has been created of disrupting migration and considering it as being something done only in a state of emergency? And alongside that state of emergency, like, Maza, you had mentioned uncertainty, in these photographs that you showed, and thinking about that state of emergency, thinking about all of the ways that we weaponize fear or pain. I'm thinking about the credible fear questionnaires that we demand that somebody prove that they are afraid enough or have been traumatized enough that they would deserve to be able to land, to be able to be received in this country. and that it has been created as an unnatural condition in the United States, existing again only in emergency, as if and then that it requires an allegiance to or a fealty to wherever it is you arrive. You must prove the emergency, and then if you are believed, such as in the credible fear questionnaire, you must then pledge to a type of second-class citizenship, the fact that you will never be of the city of the state, so a kind of hypo or nether or infra citizenship. And then I want to just kind of touch even on some of the languages that we're using when we're talking about migration as having arrived. And this will be kind of the last thing that I mention, is that as soon as you become in migration, in the motion of it, is that you begin to lose whatever human rights the place you are arriving at offers to its, quote, citizens. And so your relationship shifts in relationship to which humanitarian services are available to you at that point. For example, if you cross illegally, you suddenly forfeit your right to humanitarian services, to being treated like whatever they deem a human. And then just thinking, I'm thinking a little bit about naturalization and, as being a process of correct migration and on its way toward a kind of a citizenship, and thinking of language-wise as a poet, naturalization as being something that again is related back to like birthright, back to doctrine of discovery, back to the Monroe Doctrine, back to manifest destiny. And so those are just some of the languages and words and terms I want to drop in or weave in to some of what we were talking about, because I think the indigenous perspective, in terms especially of reception and creating a space in which people can arrive, and beginning to think about how self-determination sits next to the needs and necessities of those who are in migration or of migration or in or of diaspora, is extremely important. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Natalie. And thank you so much to all of our panelists. And so we will now turn to a brief discussion between our speakers that will be moderated by three of the fellows, Daniel, Delali, and Marcos.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all, Maza and Natalie and Giannis, for your wonderful remarks. I'm Daniel. I'm another one of the Mahindra Center Fellows this year. And just to kick off the questions, I want to sort of pick up on a phrase that Maza said that I think sort of can really ground whatever subsequent conversation that we have, which is, and correct me if I'm, or forgive me if I'm not totally quoting you correctly, but you're talking about the face and what a face contains and the history that's in it. And so I'm curious if each of you could sort of talk about how your own biographies and personal experiences inform your work, your own personal histories, and how, obviously this is a very big question, but just several kinds of examples of how your own histories, your own formative experiences, often, when we're very young and can't contextualize sort of in a migration in intellectually, is in some ways some of the most powerful formative experiences that we have around migration. And so I'm wondering if you can sort of provide texture and intimacy in your work through your own personal experiences, and how that might show up in your various genres, be it poetry, fiction, or scholarship and curation.
Who would you like us to start?
Whoever wants to go first.
Okay. Yeah, I at the beginning I said a couple of things that hopefully gave a hint on how I got into migration, but I think, Daniel, your question about prior biographical experiences, and I mean by that not just individual, but collective biographical experiences, our situatedness in a specific national context shaped our interest in migration. So I grew up in Greece, in a country that was forcefully homogenized through processes of whitening, but also processes of kind of displacement and forced homogenization with the expulsion of the others, religious minorities, ethnic minorities. And of course, you know, it was one of the first nation states to be established in Europe. So this was not unique to the specific country. It was the foundational logic of modernity, that the future is nation states that actually are homogenized in all sorts of ways. So that process I got to not experience because I'm too young for that, but I got to study through looking at the historical kind of process of the constitution of the country as a whole. And in fact, you can, as an archaeologist, you can realize early on that materiality is extremely difficult to erase completely. So the nation state has attempted to erase not only social heterogeneity, but also the heterogeneity of the material world. So despite this process of erasure and homogenization of the materiality, you can still find material traces that speak to the multiplicity, to the multicultural nature of the world that I did not experience, but I studied. So that actually encouraged me to reflect on how contemporary materiality can contribute to the study of the phenomenon of migration. If materiality resists, if it endures despite the process of erasure, I believe that we can actually say things by looking at the most minutiae of the material experience and world. So that's one kind of one answer, I guess, to your question. There is a lot that can be said also in relation to what we've been discussing about language, and I'm very, very glad that we are converging, in fact, in the panel, that words are extremely important in terms of the violence that sometimes commit. And I believe that even the word migrant is a word that commits violence to people. That's why I love what Natalie said about diasporin and diaspora scattering, because it focused on the process of moving. I come to realize that when I want to speak about the people I interact with, I would rather use the word people on the move, which is very close to scattering or moving. I don't want any longer to use the word migrant, because these are individual subjects with their own worlds, emotions, feelings, memories, identities, past experiences, professions. And the process of nation state and of bordering commits huge violence by using the term migrant for them. So that's one simple kind of point in relation to what we were saying about language.
We'll go in the same order. It's interesting, Daniel, with that question. My background has really informed, I think, my focus in my writing. I'm an immigrant. I'm a Black woman. I'm an African in the United States. I'm Ethiopian. I came to the US when I was relatively young because of a revolution that had broken out in Ethiopia. I brought with me memories of that moment, but was often met with silence when I would ask my family about why I remembered certain things. Why were people suddenly just disappearing? What was going on? Why were the soldiers in our house? It just wasn't talked about. And I think that was probably the first moment, those years, I began to realize the importance of words and what silence can do to reconstruct family memories and family histories. My conversations with my family and with my family history has been an extended and ongoing period of discovery. I still don't know everything, and I'm still finding things out. Even as of a few weeks ago, somebody will just drop a piece of information and it will completely require me to reorganize what I thought I knew about my family and people who are either here or no longer here. So I think this is one of the reasons I have become so invested in what language can do, but also how language can obscure what has happened in the past. I would almost say that my inclination or my interest in these issues, this humanitarian crisis that's happening across the bodies of water in the world and on land, across borders, that interest comes from my own background. But I would really like to believe that you don't necessarily need that background to care and to be invested in the human lives that are currently at stake. So I think that my interest stems not from my background, but really a more focused investigation of memory and language and these felt absences when things are not discussed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking a lot, Yanis, just as you are, questioning the word migration. I think at one time it was so close to colonizers, like, right? That's kind of where the word is tethered in a way, one of its roots anyway. And so that the implication to settle. So immediately there's a defensiveness that begins to happen. Who must be kept out? Who is trying to settle? And I think, Maz, I think that the obscure, the idea of the opaque, I think the way Black Studies thinks of opacity is really important here. But like to remain illegible or unmappable. So on the US-Mexico border, for example, we have something called prevention through deterrence. So because they've mapped it, we're trying, I'm saying we as the United States is trying to force them through one of the most dangerous, devastating corridors of the desert. Not only if the heat doesn't kill you, then very, very easily hypothermia because of the cold in the evenings. And so that idea of mapping, which is again why I think language is so important, and language not to define, but language to help that obscurity, like you had offered, Maza, and thinking of opacity. In my community, I grew up on a reservation, which is, there are many of us have grown up in these situations where it's almost an absurdity. Like, what does it mean to grow up on a reservation? Like, this is something so old from so long ago, from a mindset that shouldn't still exist. And thinking about how those reservations became, we couldn't move, we couldn't leave the reservation. It reminds me, it's very similar to the ways that we criminalize migration. The fact that I have an older brother who very recently had an ankle bracelet on his ankle. He couldn't leave a certain parameter, had to be home in some ways. And I just thought, like, this is another iteration of stopping certain kinds of migrations. And I think for me, that idea of the aspiros, so I have a friend, Joanna, who I talk with about the Greek language a lot. And so we're always kind of breaking down words. But I'm thinking of something that Keguro Macharia said in a talk not long ago, and I'm paraphrasing, but it shifted a lot of the ways that I think. But to imagine diaspora as a singular formation, and again, this goes back to that idea of the movement and how dangerous, like Yanis, you were saying, like to be on the move, to be like the danger of that, right? The unpinnability of it. And then the last two things I'll just offer is, like, I grew up on a river, on the water, and that's migration in motion. Like, that's the way that we all move with our waters. And then just this idea of the global, it's often denied to indigenous peoples because we tend to pretend place is an anchor, but that the global migration is actually what returns us, I think, to a lot of our indigenous values, maybe even some of those memories, so that to scatter is not necessarily to fragment, but it can also be momentum, and it can be a kind of lushness if we're allowed it, you know.
So thank you all for your comments. I've really enjoyed listening to you. My name is Delali Kumavia, and I'm one of the Mahindra Humanities Fellows this year. So my question for you all focuses on land and water bodies, because in all of your comments, you've touched on these spaces. And there's a way in which migration tends to culminate around certain land masses or environments or water bodies. So Maza, in your most recent novel, for instance, the mountains provide a space of shelter and also provides a space to recalibrate socioeconomic class hierarchies of the characters in the resistance movement, even as it signals the continuing dispossession of Ethiopian people during this war. And Natalie, in your work, the river, or the Colorado River specifically, permits the examination of the incommensurabilities between language and indigenous life worlds. And Yanis, in your work, the material remains of migratory movements through the Mediterranean Sea testify to what you've referred to just in your conversation as a mechanism of separation. So I'm curious about how we can think about landscapes and water bodies and other natural environments as telling us something about the movements of people in time and space.
Maza, you would like to go first?
Yanis.
Sorry. You did that to me before. So.
You know, Delali, as soon as you asked your question, the thing that came to mind right now is we're talking about land. You talked about water bodies, but I'm thinking of bodies on water and the bodies that traverse the land. And this is where I got stuck because I was one of the questions. I've been studying this war of 1935, looking at the landscape, but also well aware of how landscape changed because of the bodies that were on it, the destructive forces that leave nothing untouched, not the bodies, nor the landscape, nor that place where the people will eventually settle in order to find some kind of peace. I think the scarring is both physical, geographical boundaries, borders are scars that we leave on land that then inflict their own wounds or their own definitions and languages on people. So this is, just some thinking around that question.
Okay, maybe I should go next. Thank you, Delali. This is a very, very generative, very, very interesting and important question. I'm thinking that what Natalie talked about, like the phenomenon of prevention through deterrence in the Mexico-US border, is also, in fact, present in the Mediterranean as well. Because, in fact, the crossings from Africa or from Asia to Europe, there are land crossings, but they're blocked. They have been blocked. There are crossings through Spain. There's Ceuta and Melilla, so you can actually get into Spain through that. And there's also the crossing of Evros from Turkey to Greece. But because they have been blocked militarily, people are forced to take a dinghy and cross through the deep waters of the Mediterranean, hence the deadliest crossing in the world. So that's another expression where landscapes, sea masses, the environment has been militarized and weaponized against the people on the move. So that's one way of thinking about how in both major crossings, both major borders between the global south and the global north, there are similar policies of drafting natural features and the landscape in the service of a global apartheid, in fact. But I'm also thinking in the Mediterranean in terms of islands as spaces where people can be contained. And I see this in the Aegean. There's a long history, of course, in island biogeography, and also in islands being places of exile and detention. But in the present European Union regime, the islands in the Aegean are places of containment, because they're open air prisons. People are not allowed, once they cross into islands, to move into mainland and continue their journey into Northern Europe and to Western Europe. They have to stay there in camps or, in various structures, because it's seen that the island as a very contained and small landmass can operate as an open air camp, in fact. And you could also see that as a strategy of buffering, as a strategy of rendering whole countries or parts of countries as buffer zones, right? We want to, keep them contained in a kind of intermediate and gray zone between the south and the center and the core of the global north. So I see how these, the logic of specific contained land masses or large bodies of water or the desert in the Mexico-US border become, in fact, geopolitical kind of entities in the service of a certain logic of bordering and separation and apartheid.
Yeah, gracias for that question. I love just having the opportunity always, I think, to think about the temporal and the spatial in relationship to this, because we tend to think maps immediately, and if we haven't been to those places. I think one of the things that it strikes in me is just, again, thinking about the idea of the emergency next to what is sensual or what is sensuality. And, I'm thinking back to Maza and Yanis, you both said the physical, the geographical, geopolitical, the boundaries, where even the body then becomes a boundary or a border, that we've pressed it into this condition. It becomes the border or boundary between an ocean, right? Between thirst, like what does breathing air versus having that obstructed by water in drownings, things like that. And I'm thinking about the ways that water and land do defy the temporal and the spatial, which is why they're so heavily policed and mapped and these things. Again, like the temporal and spatial and how those kind of direct our policies, like how many days, for example, can we keep you in detention? How long must you wait in order to be processed? How many days can a body go without water? And then in terms of, I'm really struck, Yanis, about thinking about these structures and, as well as like how the policies take those structures and then create new ones, like what are the least amount of amenities we need to provide to somebody in a camp or to somebody in detention? Sometimes it's not even a blanket, sometimes it's not food, it's not running water. And so the ways I think that the land and water, the way the body just becomes something disposable so that the land and water can be utilized in the ways they need to be. And so coastlines, for example, how dangerous they become or how fortified they become because the land is property or the water is property, become essential then to protect for the citizen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marcos Almeida. I am a historian of Central Africa and one of the postdoc fellows here in the Mahindra Humanities Center. I, of course, have several questions to all of you, but I would like to start with a general one, which is my first question is about the category of time. It seems to me that in different ways, you are all traveling through multiple temporalities in your work. Yanis is an archaeologist of the ancient Mediterranean who is working with recent events. Maza Mengistu is a contemporary writer that writes about the 30s and the 70s. And Dia's poetry alludes to history, making reference to Aztecs and conquerors. And you all do so in 3 different genres. So while I was reading all of your work, I was thinking some question from Fernando Brodel actually came to my mind, which is a very famous one, who says that time sticks to your thinking like soil to a gardener's spade. So why is that? And it perhaps because in some ways you all see more continuities rather than change in the histories and the stories that you tell, perhaps because it has something to do with colonialism. Thank you. Maza, if you could go first. I saw you. Yeah.
I was going to pick on Natalie. I think. Thank you for that question, Marcos. I thought a lot about this temporality, the way that I guess both writing about the revolution in the 70s, the war of 1935, writing also about the crisis that is ongoing in the Mediterranean and the borders of Libya. I've been thinking about what I mean by time when I speak of time, and the difference between that and memory, and the way that memory tends to collapse time, so that it eliminates any of the borders between the past and the present and the future, so that we are constantly in a moment of nowness, no matter what. And also, we are also constantly in this nowness that contains what was and what will be. And we're trying to navigate as best as possible that terrain while time keeps moving in a linear way. And yet I don't think human beings are conditioned to think and feel and imagine in a linear capacity. I think what is happening surrounding these conversations of migration, the crises that's happening in Lesbos and everywhere else, is happening it's happening in linear fashion, and we're dealing with a situation that contains centuries, that contains at least decades, but definitely centuries, I think. And this is what Natalie was saying. There are laws that are incapable of encompassing everything. And I think the language has to change.
Okay, I think I can go first. Well, on temporality, we can say so many things, and we can stay here for many, many hours. Just to follow from Maza's thread, I think chronometry and linearity is how regimes, institutions, and authorities tend to see time, and also our own education and all these things. But in fact, I would agree with her that experiential time is something very different. It is memory time, and it is multi-temporal. It contains all these different times inside it. And I think that's how I tend to see all my work, not just the work on migration. I see it as a process of multi-temporality. So rather than Brodel that you invoke, Marcos, I would go into thinking about Bergson, for example, a French philosopher of time and memory, who thinks that every perception is full of memories, that in fact multitemporality is embedded in our sensorial experience, our bodily experience, our living. Yeah, our own senses are multitemporal. We see a thing and immediately we connect it to all other experiences that we have actually lived in our own lives. So that's at the level of reflection and perception, but even at the level of politics, we can think about the contemporary moment, as I said at the very beginning, as a process of the long duration of colonialism. And I think it was very, very clear in all our presentations that we're dealing with histories that endure. So duration for me is fundamental. Another concept I've been thinking a lot recently in relation to migration is the concept of haunting. And in fact, as we know, philosophers like Derrida have experimented with the idea of hauntology. So haunting not just as something negative, but as something positive in the sense of an ontology of life. How we can live our lives through hauntings, how we can embrace the haunting that in fact exists in human history and make it a way of living. That's how I want to think about what I experience on Lesbos and elsewhere.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. So one of the ways that, so in Mojave thinking, which feels lucky to live in this world, like time is not at all linear. And then just in terms of colonialism, like it cannot be in order to survive, right? Like it's a series of planes, which is why I think memory and the idea of haunting, like those, one of the ways I arrive at both of those words is that they are sensualities. So I think time in some way clocks us and maps us, whereas memory, it allows us to be sensual. And Giannis, some of what you were saying, like it strikes me because we believe that our now experiences are also part of our memory experiences. So there's a way that maybe what we're experiencing now, where we actually become sensual to it, is in that kind of memory. So that there is that the now, as I think you had said, that it contains what was and what will be. And again, I think that's what makes it dangerous. That's what makes some of us, or whoever our we's are, become dangerous to whichever states that we are within or of or almost toward. So duration has been a word I'm really curious about. That word, it's something that I've been talking with several Indigenous scholars about, is that and how duration operates and what it projects on us of what we must absorb. So I'm really interested in that word of duration. And I wonder also about duration. So in Mojave, for example, when someone passes away, we burn the house. So nothing, there's a way that, and then you start anew in a new place. And we have a ceremony that really celebrates the new place, the new structure you've built. And so I wonder a lot about duration and how that affects or disrupts intentionality or sensuality. So in relationship to time, it's something I'm trying really hard to find a lexicon for, and to think about. So if time is linear, which I think it is, even though many of our experiences of it subvert it and become across planes. So I'm thinking of the different ways that memory, imagination, how those become in some ways disruptions to time, because I don't know that I can dislocate time from space, because they become so ordered and structured and they're used by regimes so much, but yeah, no, that's a really generous space to think into. I feel grateful for those, both of your replies.
Can I just say a very, very small thing in relation to what we were saying as a follow-up? In fact, is that okay, Marcos?
Of course, go ahead.
I was just saying to thank you for what Natalie said in relation to burning the house. This is something that's in fact happening in the Neolithic villages I excavate in Greece too. At the end of somebody's life, or at the moment of a major kind of change, things burn down, but in fact, that actually helps in their duration, because certain things become much more solid, much more durable with fire. And also people build a new house on the top of it, and sometimes use the foundations of the previous structure in the building of the new one. So I can see both the moment of disruption and break, and the moment of continuity, the moment of duration. And finally, in relation to duration, I think I believe that matter, materialities, things are fundamental in the process of duration. That we find things that were created millions of years ago, which means that a fundamental property of matter is its ability to endure, to actually last. So that's my archaeological contribution to the discussion.
Thank you so much for all your instigating answers. I will now turn it back to Simona to moderate some questions.
Thank you so much so far for the stimulating conversation. And I know we're a little bit short on time, but I did want to at least get the opportunity to have some audience questions posed. And maybe this builds off of this question builds off of the notion of duration, and also about scattering and sowing that Natalie brought up. And it also just struck me as an aside that often when seeds are scattered, depending on the species, that can be a regenerative force for a plant, that oftentimes also through burning and fire and scattering, you see this possibility for further duration. But in any case, I'll get to the question because maybe that relates. So building on this notion of scattering and sowing, and this kind of proximity to seeds, could you all mention or talk a little bit more about this intimacy with landscape that we might attribute to indigeneity, but which also can be accessed by people on the move? So this person asked in particular, is diaspora or any other configuration of language a means of giving people on the move access to a restored or intimate indigenous type of relationship with land, and how that might be reflected on in the work that you're doing?
I'll do my due diligence and I'll do one where I'm first. I think it's a matter of language. So I actually think diaspora is it can be, right, a generous term. And I think the thing that we've been a bit more stingy with is the idea of indigeneity, especially through the Western lens. And indigeneity, an indigenous relationship, so it should be on the move. I feel like it's from before the beginning. It's the way we moved in relationship, traveling even out of curiosity, not only for war and emergency, but traveling to carry, traveling as memory, right? Like that's how we traded knowledges. I'm even thinking, Giannis rebuilding the house. That's the importance of that, is that's how we share knowledge with the next generation. Like that's how we teach. We teach through story, through memory, through these movements. And so when I'm thinking about, I guess just the one thing I want to offer is that for me, my relationship with what I think indigeneity is something I want to be able to offer to everybody, because I think there's a way that I am a certain kind of sensuality in relationship to my community and to my land. And there's a way that I become more than the state, which has tried to dislocate me from those things. And I would like to think that if I were ever in the position where I needed to arrive at a new land and a new water, I might find similar practices to be in relationship with it. And so I would hope that we don't separate diaspora from still maintaining indigenous relationships with lands and waters and one another.
Yeah, I can go on from what beautiful things that Natalie said. I think we all agree here that we see indigeneity not in static genealogical senses, but in relational senses. It's a matter of relationship with lands, relationship with memories, with stories, with other people, with beings in general, with plants and animals. And I saw that process of the willingness to establish relationships with people on the move, even on Lesbos, when they know they are going to be there only for a few months or a year. They do want to go out and connect with the landscape, even if it's through gathering firewood or gathering grains to cook, or building a shelter, or even an oven, a bread oven, in an environment that they know they're not going to be there for very long. So that process of engagement with the local materials, with the local plants, with the local animals, they were actually establishing relationship with stray animals around as well, for me indicates not only a willingness to emplace somebody into that kind of locality, but also to connect relationally with the land. Finally, there is another process that actually indicates a sense of locality, indigeneity, and emplacement, and that's the process of death. People who tragically perish in the crossing very often are buried on the island in migrant ceremonies. So that land receives them, that land keeps them. So they are suspended burials, but they are burials in that specific locality. So there's a strong connection being established between them as a collectivity and as individuals, and the soil and the place and the locality of an island like the island of Lesbos.
Thank you both for this thinking here. The only thing that I would like to add, it was something that springs off of what Yanis was saying. This connection that people have with land, the desire to connect with the ground on which they were born, even as they move on to somewhere else. I was watching a documentary and also had a chance to speak with some people who work very closely with those people on the move who were crossing the Mediterranean and coming to Italy. And we were also discussing those people who never made it to their desired location and were ended up buried in other places, wherever they're found, and often in unmarked graves, because no one knows exactly who they are. And sometimes those bodies are found and would be found with dirt from their home sewn into their clothes or put somewhere that could be found on them as an identity, so that forensic scientists could get that dirt and then do tests and be able to locate exactly where they came from, and somebody then would be able to identify who they are. This is a way that is being used or was in recent years to identify people. Instead of an ID card, you take land with you. And so I'm struck by what both of you are saying here in remembering them.
It makes me think a little bit of like the connection between, I think of these two words a lot in relationship to duration, Yanis, and I'm also thinking of Shadow King, but that I like that the abiding becomes the abode, that those, how tethered those two words are, and that that would be where you would be living in the waiting to return. That where you make your abode at that point is in that handful of earth that is sown into your clothing, and that again, that abiding becomes that structure. Yeah, that image gave me goosebumps when you were talking about it.
So we'll have one more question from the audience, and so we'll each give you an opportunity to briefly answer it and end with this one. But so the audience member asks, my question is about care as an essential aspect of the work that you are all doing. So care for the subjects, the context, the language, the narration. How do you care for the self that does this work, in particular in the context of the history, stories, poetry, and sites that you work with that can often be so destructive? And so maybe we'll start with Natalie, then Yanis, and then Maza.
Yeah, I think language can be the care. It can be a practice of it. I think that's what's so powerful about poetry is it's, you know, the poem sometimes is how we reach one another, but that the language, and I mean, I'm feeling it here with you all, is like the words we use become so important because we're imagining that they might hold someone else the way that they've held us, even if it's holding us simply in wonder or, you know, a way of thinking about how we might touch one another. And that's again why I think like memory, language, like to be able to imagine these as physicalities, you know, and what it, just for example, what does it mean along the way in motion, in movement, in migration, to hear someone call your name, you know, to be able to return to the self. And so that's one of the ways I consider poetry making is, first, I'm trying to call to myself and to my beloved so that we might touch one another or recognize one another. And, you know, I'm thinking to this line that Fadi Joudah said, and it's part of my poetic practice, but he was talking about, it was in the Palestine Rights Festival, and he said, you know, if a Palestinian writes a love poem, will they be believed? And so that's, I think, where I'm at in terms of the care of language, is that I want to make as much of it as I can until it becomes something where I'm not so much worried about it being believed, but where I know I can hold myself and the people I love, and maybe most importantly, just like strangers within that, whether it's a story or a poem or a name.
Yeah, I just want to show one image as a way of responding to your question, Simone, if that's okay. So can you see this? Yeah, so care. There are two ways through which I describe what I do in the context of the border migration. One is an archaeology of witnessing, and the other is the archaeology of care. And I think care extends not only towards the humans and the people, but also towards objects. And one way through which I'm trying to work is through the care and attention that we extend to objects that travel with people on the move. So what you see here is a baby milk feeder, originally from Iraq, which was found on the island of Lesbos in the big so-called Live Vest cemetery. So there were still actually traces of milk inside this. We collected it, we curated it, we cared for it, we are showing it in our exhibition, and it's going to continue traveling, telling stories through its own materiality and its own kind of witnessing as an artifact that speak of families traveling through, you know, from Iraq to Europe through Lesbos and through the sea. So that's another way through which I think care can be expressed, to pick up something that people would consider as rubbish and call it an evocative object, an important material object, an object of bodily care to start with, but also an object of care in the broader context of migration.
Thank you both for this. There's so much here to think about. I think, like Natalie, language has been for me the way to care for the self that's doing the looking, both in poetry. I'm immersed always in conversation with the poets that I have sitting on my desk, and the images, like the artist Dawit Petros that I showed, the way that takes me not only to a point of contact with what I'm concerned about, but also helps move me into other questions, other leaps of the imagination. And so for me, it's both in words and in images, and the spaces that leaves for me to roam freely.
Thank you all. This has been wonderful. I'm going to turn it over to Howie, my colleague and another postdoc.
Thank you so much, Simona. I'm Howie Tam. I am one of the postdocs at the Mahindra Center this year, along with Simona, Delali, Marcos, Daniel Grant, and Daniel McDonald. And as we come to the conclusion of this event, I have to say that I am left humbled and deeply marveling at the space that we have gathered together, that we created together in the last hour and a half. You know, in the most trying of circumstances right now, full of pain, suffering, fear, death, and the pandemic is only one small part of that. And because we are talking about care and beauty and creativity, I'm reminded of a quote from Fred Moulton, who said in conversation with Saidiya Hartman, quote, "Anybody who thinks that they can understand how terrible the terror has been without understanding how beautiful the beauty has been against the grain of the terror is wrong." With those profound words, I am so deeply grateful for our panelists today, Maza, Yanis, and Natalie, for joining us and sharing with us their expertise and wonderful insights. And most importantly, I want to thank you, our audience members, who've come to us from vast distances through wires and light waves and airwaves and what have you, and to join with us in this beautiful space that we have created. I hope that what you've heard today resonates with you as it has with me, and I hope it will continue to stay with you for some time yet. I'd like to quickly mention that the recording of today's event is available on the Mahindra Humanities Center's website and on our YouTube channel. So please feel free to share it with friends and colleagues who can't make it today. And I also invite you to visit the Mahindra Humanities Center website for upcoming events, and we hope to see you there as well. So stay safe, everyone. Enjoy your morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And please do stay in touch with us. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.